They dragged her trunk across the asylum's front steps at 4 in the morning, before the sun had even thought about rising, and Lena Cherney stood barefoot on the frozen gravel in nothing but a cotton shift, while Matron Hale padlocked the door behind her. "You have until the sheriff arrives at 7, the matron said through the mail slot. Her voice carried the bored tone of someone cancelling a milk delivery. "If he finds you on the grounds, it becomes a trespass matter." "I cannot help you then." Lena was 19. She had been a ward of the Briarstone State Asylum for the feeble-minded since she was 6 years old, though there was nothing feeble about her mind, and never had been. Her crime at age 6 had been muteness. She did not speak until she was almost 8, and by then the commitment papers had been signed by a woman who called herself Lena's aunt, and no one had bothered to revisit the question. 13 years. She had scrubbed the asylum's tile floors with lye soap until her knuckles split and healed and split again in a permanent cycle like the rings of a tree. She had learned to read by stealing minutes with discarded newspapers the orderlies used to line bird cages. And she had raised silkworms. This was the part that mattered, though Lena did not yet know how much. She had found the first clutch of silkworm eggs on a mulberry branch that grew through a crack in the cellar wall during her 9th year at Briarstone. The cellar was where they sent girls who screamed at night, which Lena never did. She went there voluntarily because it was the only place in the asylum where no one watched her. The eggs had hatched in the warmth of her palm, and she had fed the larvae on mulberry leaves she stripped in secret, and she had watched them spin cocoons of silk so fine it caught the light from the single cellar window like spun mercury. By her 19th year, she had over 200 silkworms cycling through their generations in wooden trays she had built from broken bed slats. She had taught herself to reel the silk onto spindles made from chair legs. She had woven small squares of fabric on a loom she constructed from a picture frame and finishing nails. None of this saved her. The new superintendent, Dr. Aldis, had arrived in October with a mandate to modernize. Modernize meant cutting costs. Cutting costs meant reducing the patient census. And Lena, who had no family on record, no advocate, no legal standing, was the easiest line to cross off the ledger. They let her keep her trunk, which held 3 changes of clothes, a Bible she had never opened, and 14 small squares of silk she had woven over the past 2 years. They did not let her keep the silkworms. The town of Harrow Creek, Nebraska population, 412, sat 3 miles downhill from the asylum. Lena had never been there. She had never been anywhere. She put on her shoes, which were men's shoes, 3 sizes too large, stuffed with newspaper, and she walked. She reached Harrow Creek at sunrise. The town was already awake. A man loading feed sacks onto a wagon stopped and stared at her. A woman sweeping the boardwalk outside the general store paused with the broom handle against her collarbone. Lena asked the feed sack man if there was work available. He looked at her shoes. He looked at the trunk she was dragging. He said, "You are from up there," and pointed toward the hill. The woman with the broom said, "We do not take asylum people." Her voice was not cruel. It was simply factual, like announcing that the store did not carry a particular brand of soap. "There is the church," she added, pointing south. "Reverend Moody sometimes helps transients." Lena was not a transient. She had nowhere to transit to. But she walked south. Reverend Moody was not at the church. A boy of about 12 sat on the church steps, eating a biscuit. He told Lena that Reverend Moody had gone to Platte City for a revival and would not return until Thursday. This was Saturday. The boy's name was Orrin. He studied Lena with the uncomplicated curiosity of a child who had not yet learned to be afraid of strangers. "You smell like lye," he said. Lena said, "I know." Oren told her there was a root cellar behind the old Kirchner place. Nobody had lived there since Mr. Kirchner died of the flux in '86. The house itself had burned 2 years later, some said deliberately for the insurance, though there was no one left to collect it. But the root cellar was still there. It was dug into the side of a hill 8 feet deep, with a timber-framed entrance and a door that mostly closed. She found it an hour later. The Kirchner property sat at the edge of town, where the prairie began its long roll toward the Platte River. The house was a charred rectangle of foundation stones. The root cellar entrance was half hidden by a thicket of wild plum, the branches bare and thorned in the November cold. She pulled the door open. It scraped across frozen dirt and stopped halfway. She turned sideways and went in. The smell hit her first. Not rot, not decay. Something older and more mineral. Cold stone and still air, and the faint, sulphurous tang of something she could not identify. The cellar was larger than she expected. The walls were packed, earth-reinforced with limestone slabs, and the ceiling was timber and sod low enough that she could touch it with her fingertips. The floor was dirt-dry, despite the season. Against the far wall, a natural seep of water trickled from between 2 stones and pooled in a shallow depression before draining into a crack in the floor. She touched the water. It was warm. Not hot, not steaming, but distinctly, unmistakably warmer than the November air above ground. She knelt and put her fingers into the pool. The water was perhaps 70 degrees. It smelled faintly of sulphur and iron. The cellar was warmer than outside by a wide margin. The packed earth walls held the geothermal heat from whatever underground seep fed this spring. She could feel it in the soles of her feet, through her oversized shoes. The ground itself was warm. She sat down on her trunk and looked around the root cellar in the thin light that came through the half-open door. Wooden shelves lined one wall empty, except for a few mason jars clouded with mineral deposits. A hook in the ceiling held a rusted chain that had once suspended something, a lantern or a meat rack. In the far corner, partially buried under a collapse of soil, she saw the edge of something angular and deliberate. A wooden box, perhaps 2 feet long, wedged behind the limestone slabs. She left it alone for now. She had more immediate problems. The first night she slept on the bare ground, with her trunk as a pillow, and her silk squares layered over her chest. The cellar stayed warm. The seep trickled its quiet mineral song. Above her, through 8 feet of earth and sod, the November wind tore across the Nebraska prairie at 30 miles an hour, and she could not hear it at all. In the morning, she began to work. She gathered dried prairie grass in armfuls and packed it between the timber beams of the ceiling for insulation. She found flat stones along the creek bed and laid them as a floor around the warm seep, creating a crude hearth of geothermal heat. The warm water she discovered could be channeled. She dug a shallow trench with a stick and lined it with creek clay, directing the seep along the base of the north wall before it drained. The wall stayed warm to the touch, radiating gentle heat into the space, like a clay stove. She needed food. She had no money. She walked back to town and stood outside the general store until the owner, a man named Pruitt, came out and asked her what she wanted. Work, she said. He gave her a broom and told her to sweep the stockroom. He paid her 15 cents and a tin of sardines. He did not invite her inside the store proper. She ate the sardines in the cellar that evening, savoring the salt and oil, and she saved the tin because the metal was useful. Over the next week, she returned to Pruitt's store each morning. She swept, she stacked, she hauled. He paid her in coins and food, and once on the 3rd day, a wool blanket that had been returned because of a moth hole. She mended the hole with silk thread she unraveled from one of her squares, and the mend was so fine that Pruitt noticed it and said nothing, But the next day, he gave her a second blanket without being asked. On the fourth day, she dug out the wooden box from the corner of the cellar. It was a silkworm rearing tray. She sat with it in her lap for a long time. It was handmade, dovetail jointed, with a mesh bottom for airflow, and small ventilation holes drilled in precise rows along the sides. It was not crude. It was the work of someone who understood sericulture. On the bottom, burned into the wood with a hot nail or a brand, were the words, E. Kirchner, Harrow Creek, Neb, and below that, in smaller letters, for M. She asked Oren about the Kirchners the next time she saw him. Oren knew only that old Kirchner had been a German immigrant, a quiet man, a bachelor. No family anyone knew of. For M. Moore. Lena turned the tray over and over in her hands. She ran her fingers along the dovetail joints. She smelled the wood. Cedar to repel moths. Whoever made this knew what they were doing. She needed silkworms. There was a mulberry tree behind the asylum. She knew this because she had spent 13 years watching it through the cellar window, its branches pressing against the glass like green hands in summer. She could not go back to the asylum. But mulberry trees were not exclusive to asylums. Oren, she said, do you know where mulberry trees grow around here? Oren thought about it. There is one by the creek, he said. Past the mill. Nobody picks from it because the berries stain something awful. She found the tree. It was a red mulberry, not ideal for silkworms, which preferred white mulberry, but serviceable. The leaves were gone for the season, but the buds would come in spring. She needed eggs that would overwinter. She had no eggs. She had left her silkworms at Briarstone. On the 8th day, she found them. She was deepening the warm water channel along the north wall when her stick hit something that was not stone and not clay. She dug carefully. It was a glass jar sealed with wax buried deliberately in the warm earth near the seep. Inside the jar, suspended in a matrix of dried mulberry leaves, were silkworm eggs, hundreds of them, tiny dark seeds of possibility. Kirchner had buried them here, near the warmth, where the ground temperature stayed constant through the winter. A perfect overwintering strategy for Bombyx mori eggs, which needed a cold period, followed by gradual warming to hatch. 4M, she cradled the jar against her chest. She did not cry. Lena was not a person who cried, but she sat very still for a long time in the warm cellar with the trickle of sulphur water and the ghosts of someone else's knowledge surrounding her. And she breathed. The eggs would hatch in spring. She had months to prepare. She spent those months building. She constructed rearing trays from scrap wood Pruitt let her take from behind the store. She harvested dried grasses and wove them into mats for the cellar walls, layer upon layer, until the space held heat like a kiln. She built a spinning frame from a broken wagon wheel she found in the Kirchner Foundation rubble, and she carved reeling hooks from hedge apple wood, which was hard as iron and smooth as bone. By January she had made the cellar livable. By February she had made it comfortable. The geothermal seep kept the interior at a steady 55 degrees, even when the outside temperature dropped to 20 below. She bathed in the warm water. She dried herbs from the creek bank and hung them from the ceiling in bundles sage and wild mint, and the cellar smelled like a strange, clean medicine. People in Harrow Creek knew about her by now. Most left her alone. A few were less kind. Mrs. Calloway, the wife of the town banker, stopped Lena outside the store one February morning. Mrs. Calloway was a tall woman who wore her righteousness like a corset tight and visible. "I understand you are living in a hole in the ground," she said. Like a badger, Lena said. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Calloway leaned closer. She smelled of lavender water and camphor. Her voice dropped to the register people use when they believe they are being compassionate. I worry about you, dear. A young woman alone in a cellar. It is not natural. Perhaps you would be better served back at Brierston. Doctor, Aldous is a modern man. I could write a letter. Lena looked at Mrs. Calloway for a moment. Something moved behind the older woman's eyes, a flicker of something that might have been genuine concern buried under layers of social performance. Mrs. Calloway had lost a daughter, Lena had heard. Diphtheria 3 years ago. The daughter had been about Lena's age. I am fine, Mrs. Calloway, Lena said, but thank you for the worry. Mrs. Calloway pressed her lips together and walked away. She did not write the letter. The eggs hatched in April. Lena had moved the jar into the cellar's warmest spot near the seep and gradually raised the temperature by banking the water channel closer. The larvae emerged over 3 days, tiny and black and ravenous, and she fed them mulberry leaves she had gathered the moment the tree by the creek budded. By May, she had 216 silkworms, eating their way through pounds of mulberry leaves each day. The cellar hummed with the sound of their feeding, a dry, continuous whisper, like rain on paper. She had forgotten how much she loved that sound. By June, they were spinning. Silkworms spin their cocoons over 3 to 4 days. Each cocoon contains a single continuous thread of silk that can stretch 1,000 yards if reeled carefully. Lena had been reeling silk since she was 10. Her hands knew the work the way a pianist's hands know scales. She killed the pupae with steam from the hot seep, a method she had developed at Brierston. Then she soaked the cocoons in the warm mineral water, which softened the sericin, binding the threads, and she reeled. The silk that came off these cocoons was different. The mineral content of the geothermal water did something to the fibers. The silk was stronger, with a faint, luminous sheen that caught light like oil on water. It was without exaggeration the most beautiful raw silk Lena had ever produced. She wove it on her frame. She wove small pieces, first handkerchief-sized, testing the fabric's drape and weight. Then she wove a larger piece, a full square yard. And she noticed the pattern. She had not planned a pattern. She had been weaving a plain tabby weave, the simplest structure warp over weft. But the silk itself seemed to carry a variation in thickness, subtle but visible in angled light, that created faint lines in the fabric. Not random, deliberate. The silkworms had spun threads of slightly different diameters in a sequence that, when woven, produced what looked unmistakably like letters. She held the fabric up to the cellar's entrance in the morning light. E.K. to M. Cherney. 714 Elm. Omaha. Lena sat down on the ground. Cherney was her name. The name on her commitment papers. The name of the aunt who had signed her into Brierstone. M. Cherney. 714 Elm Street, Omaha. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the warm earth floor. The silkworms had not spelled anything. She knew this. Silkworms do not encode messages. What had happened was simpler and stranger. Kirchner had bred his silkworms selectively over years for variation in thread diameter. He had created a strain that produced a subtle but readable pattern when woven in a specific way on a specific type of frame. The rearing tray, the spinning frame in the foundation, rubble the eggs buried near the warmth. He had left a message for someone who knew how to read silk. For M. Cherney. For her mother. Lena didn't go to Omaha. Not yet. She had silkworms to tend, and a cellar to maintain, and a life small and strange and entirely her own to live. She folded the fabric with the message and placed it in her trunk next to the other silk squares. Summer passed. She sold 3 silk handkerchiefs to Pruitt for $2 each, more money than she had ever held. He sold them to a dry goods buyer from Lincoln for $5 each, and did not tell Lena the markup, though Orrin did. She sold the next batch directly to the Lincoln buyer for $4 each. Pruitt said nothing, but his jaw tightened, and after that he gave her 20 cents instead of 15 for her sweeping. The silk became known. A woman from Platte City drove 18 miles to buy a yard of it. A milliner in Omaha sent a letter of inquiry. Lena answered the letter carefully, in her cramped, self-taught handwriting, and quoted a price, and the milliner sent a bank draft by return mail. By September, she had saved $41. She had purchased a proper loom second-hand from a weaver in Grand Island who was retiring. She had expanded the cellar by digging a second chamber, shoring the walls with limestone and cedar posts. She had built shelving for 12 rearing trays. Then October came, and the sky went white. The blizzard of '93, they would call it later. It began on October the 18th with a warm morning that fooled everyone. Children went to school without coats. Farmers left livestock in open pastures. At 2 in the afternoon, the temperature dropped 40 degrees in less than an hour, and the snow came sideways, and it did not stop for 3 days. Lena felt the barometric pressure drop in the cellar. The warm seep changed. It flowed faster, as if the earth itself was bracing. She had seen this once before, at Briarstone, the spring in the cellar wall, gushing before a bad storm. She did not understand the geology, but she understood the signal. She covered the rearing trays with wool blankets. She sealed the cellar door with banked earth and grass. She filled every jar and tin she owned with warm water from the seep. And she waited. Above her, Harrow Creek came apart. The school lost its roof at 4 in the afternoon. 23 children and their teacher, a young man named Fosse, were trapped in the building, with no heat and walls that offered little more protection than a picket fence. The church steeple snapped and fell through the nave. The general store's plate glass window blew in, and the snow filled the building like white sand in an hourglass. Mrs. Calloway's house, the finest in town, lost its chimney, first, then its north wall. By nightfall, the temperature was 18 below zero. People were dying. 2 cowboys caught between ranches froze in a ravine half a mile from town. An elderly couple on the west end of Main Street burned their furniture for heat and still could not keep the frost from forming on the inside walls of their home. Lena could not hear any of this. 8 feet underground, surrounded by packed earth and limestone, and the steady radiant warmth of the geothermal seep her cellar held at 53 degrees. The silkworms ate. The water trickled. She slept. On the second morning, she opened the cellar door and could not see anything but white. The snow had drifted 6 feet high across the entrance. She dug a tunnel upward with her hands and a flat stone, and when she broke through to the surface, the wind hit her like a wall of broken glass. Harrow Creek looked like a shipwreck, roofs gone, windows shattered. Snow drifted to the eaves of buildings that still stood. A horse stood frozen upright near the livery still tied to its post, its body already stiff and white. She heard the children first. The schoolhouse was 400 yards from the Kirshner property. The sounds coming from it were not screams. They were worse than screams. They were the thin, exhausted sounds of children who had been cold for 36 hours and had stopped believing anyone was coming. Lena went back into the cellar. She filled 2 jars with warm water and wrapped them in silk. She took both wool blankets. She climbed back out and walked into the blizzard. It took her 20 minutes to cover 400 yards. The wind knocked her down twice. The second time she lay in the snow for a moment and considered not getting up. The snow was surprisingly comfortable. It would be easy to stay. She got up. The schoolhouse door was frozen shut. She kicked it until the ice cracked and the door swung inward, and the smell that came out was urine and fear and the sour breath of children who had eaten nothing in a day and a half. Fossey the teacher was sitting against the far wall with 3 children in his lap, and his coat spread over them. His lips were blue. His fingers, she would learn later, were already frostbitten beyond saving. He had given his gloves to a girl named Patience, who was 7 years old and cried when her hands hurt. Lena said, "I have a warm place. Can you walk?" Fossey stared at her. He did not seem to understand the words. One of the older children, a boy of about 13, stood up and said, "Where?" She led them back. 23 children and 1 teacher, single file through the blizzard, following the track she had broken in the snow. 3 of the smallest children could not walk. The older ones carried them. Fossey stumbled along at the rear, holding Patience against his chest. They went underground. The cellar was not large enough for 25 people. Lena did not care about large enough. She put the smallest children nearest the warm seep. She wrapped them in blankets and silk. She heated water in her sardine tins over a candle and gave it to them to drink, and the warmth moved through their small bodies like a tide coming in. Fossey sat near the door. His hands were in his lap, grey-white and swollen. He looked at Lena and said, "I thought you were from the asylum." "I am," she said. He nodded slowly. His eyes were glassy with pain. His voice, when he spoke again, had the quality of a man making a formal public statement. "I told Mrs. Calloway you should not be left alone out here," he said. "I told her it was not right. She said it was not her concern." Lena looked at him. She said, "Your hands need warm water. Not hot. Warm." She brought him a jar from the seep. Over the next 2 days, the cellar became the heart of Harrow Creek. Word spread the way word spreads in a crisis, not by announcement, but by desperate people following footprints in the snow. The Muller family came first, a father and mother and 4 children whose home had lost its roof. Then old Mr. Briggs from the feed store. Then the widow Patton and her 2 grown sons. Pruitt came on the second night, his face cut from broken window glass, carrying a sack of canned goods he had salvaged from his ruined store. Mrs. Calloway came last. She came alone. Her husband had gone to Platte City before the storm and had not returned. Her house was destroyed. She stood at the entrance to the cellar in a fur-collared coat that was soaked through and frozen stiff. And she looked at Lena, and she did not say anything for a long time. Then she said, "I am sorry." Lena made room for her near the children. At the peak, 37 people sheltered in Lena's cellar. They ate Pruitt's canned goods and drank warm mineral water and slept in shifts on the warm earth floor. The silkworms continued their work on the shelves above, unbothered by the crowd spinning their cocoons in the steady warmth, while the worst blizzard in Nebraska history raged above. The storm broke on the 4th day. The sun came out on a world remade, in white, silent and blinding, and the people of Harrow Creek climbed out of the root cellar of the old Kirchner place and stood blinking in the light like creatures born from the earth itself. 7 people in Harrow Creek died in the blizzard of '93. Without the cellar, the number would have been closer to 40. The county newspaper printed the story. The state newspaper picked it up. A reporter from Omaha made the trip to Harrow Creek and interviewed Lena, and the article he wrote was titled "The Silk Woman of Harrow Creek," and it ran with a sketch of the cellar entrance that made it look more romantic than it was. The article reached Omaha. It reached 714 Elm Street. In November, a woman arrived in Harrow Creek on the afternoon train. She was in her late 40s, thin with dark hair, streaked grey, and the careful posture of someone who had spent years making herself small. She asked at the rebuilt general store for the Silkwoman, and Pruitt pointed her toward the Kirshner property, without comment. Lena was reeling silk when the woman appeared at the cellar entrance. The light was behind the visitor, so Lena could not see her face, only her silhouette, narrow shoulders, a hand gripping the doorframe. The woman said, "Lena." Her voice was accented. "Check like Kirshner, like Journey." Lena set down her reel. She did not stand. The woman came into the cellar. She moved slowly, looking at the rearing trays, the loom, the warm seep channeled along the wall. She touched the wood of a rearing tray, and her fingers found the dovetail joints, and she stopped. "My father made these," she said. Lena said nothing. The woman, whose name was Marta Cherney, sat down on the earth floor across from her daughter. She did not explain why she had left Lena at Brierston. She did not offer excuses or apologies, or the kind of narrative that wraps abandonment in acceptable cloth. She sat and she was quiet, and after a while she picked up a mulberry leaf and began feeding the silkworms with hands that knew exactly how to hold the leaf, how to tear it, how much to offer. They worked together for an hour without speaking. The silkworms ate, the water trickled. Outside the rebuilt town of Harrow Creek went about its November business, smoke rising from new chimneys into a sky that promised more snow. Finally, Lena said, "You will need a warmer coat if you are staying." Marta looked at her. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. She said, "I know how to weave one." The next spring, the town council voted to deed the Kirshner property to Lena Cherney, all 4 acres, including the mineral rights to the geothermal seep. The vote was unanimous. Mrs. Calloway put the motion forward. She did not make a speech. She simply said the name and the acreage and asked for hands. Every hand went up. Lena built a proper workshop over the cellar that summer, with her mother's help and lumber donated by Pruitt at cost, which for Pruitt was a remarkable act of generosity. The Harrow Creek Silk Works, they called it, though the sign Oren painted for them simply read, "Zerney and Zerney." The silk still carried its strange, luminous quality from the mineral water. Lena never did figure out the exact chemistry. She did not need to. She knew the water, and she knew the worms, and she knew the weave, and that was enough. On the anniversary of the blizzard, she wove a piece of silk and hung it in the schoolhouse window where the morning light could catch it. The children pressed their faces close and looked at the faint pattern in the threads, the ghost of letters, the echo of a man who had bred silkworms to carry a message to a daughter he had never met, trusting that silk and time and warm water would do what he could not. Fossey, who had lost 3 fingers but still taught school with his remaining 7, asked Lena once what the pattern in the silk said. She told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is the strangest letter I have ever heard of." Lena smiled. She said it was not a letter. It was a map. She never did explain what she meant by that. But every autumn after, when the first cold wind came down from the north, she walked to the cellar entrance and put her hand against the limestone wall and felt the warmth coming up from deep in the earth. And she stood there for a while, not thinking about anything in particular, just feeling the heat against her palm like a pulse.